Hello, I'm Dr. Jonathan Baird. Welcome to this introductory screencast on eating disorders. As a preface to the lesson that I'll be giving live, I just want you to know this presentation addresses some topics which can be sensitive to some individuals who happen to be of the age demographic that enroll in our PA school. Now, the goal of addressing these topics is to assist you as you then have to evaluate and manage your future patients who present with the clinical features of the psychiatric disorders that we're going to be discussing. Of necessity, I recognize that some of the people in attendance may have been affected by these disorders or, frankly, might be currently affected by these disorders. We bring them up not by way of trying to open wounds, but by way of trying to prepare you for those whose wounds will be fresh. I acknowledge that these conditions affect both sexes. However, from an epidemiological perspective, they affect women, overwhelmingly so. This presentation, thus, will reflect that reality. Why don't we begin with a little bit of a story? A little bit of historical context. Most of the time, when we're talking about eating disorders, it will be found in the context of an industrialized civilization. This comes from the work of several researchers, De Nicola, Dolan, Bullock, and others. In the 90s, both Dolan and Nicola, looking at societies in rural Africa, in the Middle East, in the Far East, found that there really was no evidence of eating disorders in the rural parts of those countries. Bullock found the same thing in people in rural Russia, compared those against immigrants who came to the U.S. from rural Russia and noticed a difference. De Nicola also found the same thing in women who had immigrated to England coming from Asia, that is to say from rural Asia to now industrialized England. So clearly there seems to be an association between industrialized civilizations versus rural. Now, Dolan also published a series of case reports involving African American and Hispanic women. Now, that's significant because for a lot of years we thought that these populations were not affected. However, when you look at it over time, what you see is an increasing penetration of TV, radio, and advertising that come along with those. And as a result, a growing number of people within those populations are affected by eating disorders. So clearly, there is some sort of heavy influence in media within these industrialized societies that is helping to spread this psychiatric disorder. Now let's zoom the camera back a little bit to add some context to these findings. If you go back and really look at ancient times, ancient Greece, Rome, even into the Dark Ages, there really isn't any evidence of eating disorders found, with the exception of some Gnostic Ascetics who really were prioritizing spirituality over the temporal, but this type of food restriction in this case really seemed to be more in the context of spiritual or religious observance. The other thing that needs to be recognized in all of that is that the evidence from that period of time is sparse. And so we may not have enough data to draw conclusions. But what we do have leads us to say that it really didn't seem to be a problem. As for the Dark Ages, it's kind of interesting to consider that because one of the things that's clear about that time is that it was a period of famine, of starvation, of disease. And it seems rather counterintuitive to be voluntarily restricting food when food is already restricted. What's interesting is to look at post-World War II Italy, because the conditions in that period of time in that part of the world very much resembled those of the Dark Ages in the same geographic location. A physician by the name of Selvini-Palazzoli observed that during this relative famine, there really wasn't any evidence of eating disorders. However, as the prosperity returned to the area, so too came the eating disorders. And so he associated eating disorders with affluence. And really, in that context then, when somebody is withholding food, when they don't have to because there's an abundance of it, psychopathology really needs to be considered as one of the drivers of that. Moving forward a little bit to the Renaissance, or rebirth, as it were. And we see the emergence of a new feminine ideal, the plus-size female figure that is featured so prominently in the artistic works of the time. And really, what we think is that this really was a way of reflecting the health and the wealth ideals of the day, that if you were well fed, you were living in abundance. And the other thing that goes along with that are opportunities for education. And so we see multiple things coalescing in this period of time, including cosmetics as well. And eating disorders may have represented sort of a rebellion against traditional domestic roles or some of the more forced religious aesthetics of the time. There's what we know from this period. And then came the Victorian era, the Industrial Revolution, and a little invention that we call the corset, meaning little body. As you can see here, it's good for the waist. It's so easy. It even fits baby too. What an elegant shape. And the buttons don't pull off. Get yours at Bloomingdale's. During this period of time, Thorsten Veblen wrote a book called Theory of Leisure Class, published in 1899. In it, he wrote the following, quote, "A corpulent, meaning fat, woman no longer served as a symbol of her father's or husband's success by supplying enough to eat. Just the opposite, an extremely delicate and light in a way that seems too perfect. Woman who was obviously not working was proof of her family's prosperity." During the same period of time with the Industrial Revolution, we see a shift in how people dress. People now, instead of having garments tailored for their specific shape, now are able to go to stores where clothing has been mass-produced thanks to the result of mechanization and industrialization of this textile industry. But with that comes some problems. You see, because of all the shapes out there, how do you make many dresses to fit all of the different customers that you might have? And thus is born the idea of different sizes. And so if you're going to shop for clothing now, you go to the store and you try to decide now, what sort of a size am I? And the influences that might come with that, including the advertising influences as people are enticed to buy these sorts of dresses. Which brings us to today.
Hiya, Bobby.
Hi, Ken. I'm a Bobby girl in the Bobby world.
Never in the history of man has the influence of media been more broad and deep than it is in our day. And nowhere is that represented better than in social media. So let's talk about a few research studies that have to do with social media and body image. This is not a new topic to most people. Most people are aware of this. Research from Generation X really pointed out that teenage girls who read fashion magazines were almost 50% more likely to have an eating disorder than those who didn't. But that was magazines, and those were things that people really had to put some effort into getting relative to today. Now, social media, the computers, the phones, they are available at the push of a button. So, Clemens and colleagues looked at 144 girls who were aged 14 to 18, and they showed them Instagram photos. And some of these photos had been manipulated. Some of them had not been manipulated, meaning that they had been put through filters, or there had been altering the characteristics of the subject's body using software. And the girls were randomly exposed to either the originals or the retouched. The results were fascinating. Clearly, manipulated photos on Instagram led to lower body image. The details. Girls who had higher social comparison tendencies were more especially negatively affected. In fact, most of the subjects looked at the photos that had been manipulated and rated them more positively than the photos that had not been altered. Now, the girls participating in this study were able to detect that filters or other effects were used, but the reshaping of bodies were not noticed nearly as well. What's so important is that the girls in the study found that the manipulated pictures were realistic. Amram and his colleagues, talking about media exposure and substance use during COVID-19, pointed out a few interesting tidbits. Looking at Snapchat, 3 out of 4 photos are selfies, most often by girls, and of those, the majority are in sexualized poses. Of those selfies, about 1 in 3 have been altered. There are about 1,000 selfies that are posted on Instagram every 10 seconds, and by the time you are done with our in-class presentation, it's possible that there will have been close to 750,000 selfies posted on Instagram. Now, it's important that we consider something as we start to launch into a discussion about this particular type of psychiatric disorder, as with all of them. Let's look at this from a cognitive behavioral perspective. Each of us have beliefs. And when things happen to us, some sort of an event, it generates within us feelings, thoughts, and words, as well as actions. Now, if we were to be strictly behavioralist in our approach to the analyzation of these feelings, thoughts, and words, and actions, then we would go back to the event, and we would say, like Pavlov or Skinner, because this happened, patients reacted in this way. But the problem is that unlike rats or dogs, humans have a layer of cortex, higher centers of thinking and reasoning. And because of that, we interpret events that happen to us. We believe something about them. And depending on what we believe about them, we will feel certain things, have certain thoughts or words, and ultimately act a certain way. So as we're trying to discover why people feel, think, and act the way that they do, we're better served to focus on what it is that they believe. A few things to be aware of when it comes to the terminology of eating disorders. 1873, William Gull is the first to use the term anorexia nervosa in a journal article entitled Anorexia Hysteria. In 1979, Gerald Russell coins the term bulimia nervosa and identifies it then as a variant of anorexia nervosa. 1 year later, the DSM-3 is published, and it includes both anorexia nervosa as well as bulimia as mental disorders in the section Eating Disorders. By 1987, the DSM-3 is revised to reflect changes in practice, and bulimia is now referred to as bulimia nervosa. Now, under DSM-5, both anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa continue as eating disorders. We will also talk about binge eating disorder. I'll see you in class.